Hello, if indeed my stream has started. I'm actually going to take a second to once again check to see if my YouTube channel is going before I delve. No, I don't want to try YouTube free, and it looks like I am. Great. Okay, cool. So, hi everybody. Welcome to our week 3 lecture. And it is going to be on procedural rhetoric. So, I kind of want to get into this. There's a lot to discuss regarding this aspect of game design. And we're really not only going to talk about like the one concept of procedural rhetoric. What we're going to try to put it into the context of the first phases of game production, specifically, the sort of blue sky brainstorming ideation part of game design, game development and production. So what are the broad topics we're going to talk about today? Like I said, we're going to talk about procedural rhetoric, but we're also going to talk about aspects of game psychology that make procedural rhetoric work. Sorry, let me... Better framing. Yeah, it's okay. So we're going to talk about procedural rhetoric. What is it? We're going to talk about the psychological factors that affect procedural rhetoric. And today's case study is a game by Ian Bogos, persuasive game company Windfall. The game's name is Windfall, not the company. The company's name is Procedural or Persuasive Games. Now, this is going to be based around a lot of the knowledge from your textbook, Persuasive Games. So definitely make sure catch up with the readings that are in the syllabus for that. If you are watching this stream and you're not a member of my class, still read this book. It's pretty good. But you don't have the syllabus. Maybe I'll post it online someday. But before we get into this, let's talk about teapots first. And some of you are like, he's gone goofy. But trust me, this will all make sense. So let's say you're going to design a teapot. You're not just designing an object, you're designing a suggestion of how the object should be used. Think about that for a second. You're not just designing an object, you're designing something functional that suggests to the user how it is going to be used through its design. So if you think about a teapot in that way, you place the handle and the spout just so for maximum usability. So like where you put the handle and the spout, and other relevant features of a teapot, like, will affect the way that the user uses it, because they will, pick it up and handle it in a certain way. So here's a teapot by architect and designer Michael Graves. It has a little ball in it, a little tea infuser where you can put your tea leaves, and then this tea infuser is on a little crank, and it's on a little pulley, and you put your tea infuser into it, or you put your tea in your tea infuser, it hangs down, and then you lower the tea infuser into the tea with the little crank. Using this teapot, and then you get to watch it. Like, it's clear, so you get to watch it infuse. So that's a really fun teapot because it's interactive in how you make the infuser dip into the water and watch the tea infuse, rather than just kind of like, having it covered or having it obscured or just doing it in your cup, which can be fun too, but this way is really fun because there's a little crank. So there's like something tactile to it, and there's visual elements to it. And it's kind of bulbous and fun as a piece of design. So here's a piece that's owned by designer Donald Norman. It's called the Teapot for Masochists. Now this is a perfectly usable teapot. It has all the features that a teapot needs to be functional, but their placement creates an altogether different experience from the others. So like the first one was just a plain teapot. The second one is the Michael Graves teapot. But this one is a teapot for those who like to live dangerously, because there's no way to actually use this without getting burned in some way. You're either pouring the scalding water on yourself, or you have to handle it, unless you do it with oven mitts, and then it becomes not a good teapot to use. But that's the point. The point is that, it's a statement of design about, like, if one understands the tea handle is where you pick up the teapot, and the spout where the water comes out, like, suddenly our design, our behavior is affected, and the outcome is affected by the way the design decisions were made. Kind of like what we talked about last week with explicit design. The point of all of this is not really to talk about teapots, but to talk about objects where the designer directly creates the experience that a person has with their product. So teapots as metaphor for design in a broad sense. And we're going to talk about how in games, that's not really the case. Games are not designed products where we directly design outcomes, but we can try. So games have this weird thing about them where we call them second order designed problems, which means you're making for something for someone else to interact with. But if we're making a cup or a teapot, we're really directly designing, like, you pick up the cup according to this handle. You're designing something like really direct that is not going to have a lot of potential other outcomes. Game design, because you're not designing, something like, you're not designing the controller. The controller is something that's a direct design. Like, you grip it in a certain place, you press the buttons a certain way. The controller directly advises, in a way, the player on how it should be used. Games do something different. What they do is they create more of an environment within which, and remember, this is like systems thinking. It's an environment in which there are interactive things, objects, and the player's ability to explore and, decipher and interact with those interactive objects create gaming experiences. So, we're not directly designing something like the controller or like a phone or like a cup or like a teapot. We're designing more of like a space in which the players, explore a concept, explore an idea, explore a set of affordances. So how do we make meaning out of that? Now, this is a lecture that is about player experience. Because the thing in games, and I'm going to scooch, there we go. The thing in games is that, I always tell folks, and you've heard me say this before, game design is not like, oh, I learned Unreal, I'm a game designer. Like, there's a level of truth to that, in that, you're going to maybe do your game design in an engine like Unreal or Unity or Game Maker or Godot, but mere end user button pushing is not game design. There are a lot of factors, because really a game designer's job is to make a person you will never meet feel feelings or experience things or have emotions, have emotional experiences that you intend them to have through this indirect interactivity system that you have to just like plop them in the middle of and hope that the experience comes out right. That's our job, is to make that experience happen the right way, is to make that person you'll never meet feel feelings through an interactive computer software program. or a like boxed set of game components that with directions for use, or any other method of making outdoor tag game or something like that. So like that's kind of a big mission. That's hard. Why can't we just more directly make them feel those feelings? Well, we're game designers, and that's what games are, and that's what games do. So at the core of everything we're talking about today is this idea of player experience. It's this, how do we take, what is it about games that we can use to direct players towards those revelations, toward those experiences, towards those emotions? And especially in the case of transformational games, how are we going to make a game that changes somebody's mind, or lets them understand a complex topic, or teaches them math, or these other things that aren't just like make a sad game, but make a game that maybe changes somebody's life or gives them some sort of like other revelation? How do we do that? Well, good thing there are lots of game designers who have done this before. So we're going to talk about this a bit in the framework of game production, because this is not only your transformational games class, the class about this like very academic and experimental part of the field, but it's also your game production class, where we talk about specific phases of production. And right now, so there are 3 phases of production or 3 major overarching phases. These can be cut up in lots of different ways. But according to your textbook, it divides it into 3 major phases. This is your textbook, Playful Production Process. Lemarchand talks about ideation, pre-production, and full production. Now you may be thinking, oh, well, we're in pre-production because we haven't made the game yet. But you'd be wrong. Because actually, we are in ideation, which is where we are coming up with the parameters of the game itself. You've heard this idea of like, think outside the box, think inside the box. And those are like majorly cliche. But designers, I've heard some rhetoric in the last few years that I actually very much agree with, where it's not that you need to think outside the box, it's that you need to build the right box so that you can think inside the box. But the trick is that you've got to build a better box. So that's what we're doing. We are building the box right now. And the box is the set of design goals, experience goals, and trying to figure out what should the player, like who is the player, what do they need to know, what do they not know currently, and how will our game help them get there? Now, the idea of production, like I'm using this image kind of ironically. The idea of production is that production should not feel like herding cats. It's a nice, amusing picture to put in, like, oh, we're talking about production. But if we do this right, and we do this in an ordered way, it will not just feel like herding cats. And I don't know about you, it would actually be pretty easy to herd our cats because, like, lunchtime treats. They get themselves into nice little orderly. There's 2 of them, but they arrange themselves orderly for the right treats, so not too hard. That's why we're going to learn how to herd cats in the classroom. So phase 1, ideation. So we're going to focus a bit on this today. Like, there's going to be more in later lectures that we do on production, but right now we're going to focus on some elements of ideation. So first in ideation is you want to think about blue sky thinking, which is brainstorming. So this is this is what we did in the classroom or are doing in the classroom, depending on when you're seeing this video, where everybody gets up and they like put out a pitch of an idea to address. And you're probably starting to think about what kind of game we could make and what kind of mechanics it can have and what kind of interactivity it should have. That's blue sky thinking. That's the kind of like no limits, let's throw stuff at the wall. In some cases, literally like put post-its on the wall. That's a very good brainstorming activity, is like whiteboarding or putting post-its on the wall. Just talking through a bunch of different potential ideas. This is called blue sky thinking because there's no limits, there's no box yet, and you're kind of trying to get all the factors out into the void. You're not saying no to stuff yet because it's not real yet. So you try to come up with like all the potential permutations until you figure out which one is the thing that like really seems the most promising or makes the most sense. Or maybe is the concept with like the deepest amount of potential interactivity or satisfaction or game. I don't know how you want to rate it. But that's where you're just like throwing stuff out there. But then you want to get into a phase of research, which is really starting to think about, all right, well, this is where you start to build that box. You start to figure out, and in the case of I shared in our class Discord a talk about the level design for Marvel's Spider-Man from several years ago at the time of this recording. In that game, some of the research was like researching Manhattan and looking at the layout of streets and looking at where the geographic locations of landmarks were, figuring out what were the landmarks, starting to figure out like how this world is going to be so that then they could like start to build their version of Manhattan that was like the level design version that makes sense. Because for many reasons, like real life cities don't really work as game levels in a lot of ways. We're not going to get into that, for this. But they had to start developing like what their design of Manhattan would be based on like different factors. But they needed to know what those factors are. In a transformational game, you're going to look at things like, again, who is your audience? Like, what's the issue? Who's the audience that needs to learn about this issue? Why don't they know about the issue? Are there any other mitigating social or economic or geographic factors in play about the issue? And you start to dig into these things. What other research is out there? What other games are out there that might have addressed the issue or might have cool gameplay that you can learn from that might be promising to address the issue? That's the kind of stuff you want to do in the research phase. So this is a very big phase. That's why it's a whole assignment. It's a paper because I expect you to actually really dig into this phase. And after the research phase comes game prototyping. Now, this is when you should really start to think about tech. And you've heard me say this before, but in your book, it doesn't tell you to pick an engine until page 31. And that's after like chapters on things like brainstorming, how to brainstorm, how to research, where to research, what to research, things like that. And then, several chapters in is when it says, hey, now you can think about a game engine. And why would you want to think about a game engine so late? To me, as somebody who's done this before, doesn't seem late, but to a lot of students I know and new designers, it does seem late. But the reason is because you don't know what your box is yet. And you've heard me talk about instances where I have sat down with a client and maybe there was an assumption that it would use technology. I remember working in a studio once where I had a boss who was really trying to push mobile serious games, because mobile games were kind of hot at the time, and he thought that was going to be a good way to like make money, is to just promise everybody a mobile game on Apple. And what happened was we sat down with the client and they described how they wanted people to interact with their game and experience their game. And they said, it's going to be during these like 45-minute workshops, and people are going to download the game and play the game in the workshop. And, I'm sitting there thinking, I was like, well, the problem with that kind of environment is that, so if you only have like an hour, 45 minutes or like an hour and a half-ish, do you really want the workshop to be partially taken up by people going to the app store, and then like maybe they don't have internet or bad reception, and then they can't get the app, and all these other factors, and then they have to figure out the use of your app. Wouldn't, if we're talking about barriers to entry, wouldn't it make more sense to maybe do something kind of communal and interactive, like, and the thought was like, oh, they'll just all interact on a network and all kinds of stuff, and they'll have multiplayer. But it's like, well, why don't you get them doing something like build them a deck of cards, and then they pass the cards around and actually swap and talk, and not have to figure out like the dumb technology. Steam was coming out of my boss's ears, and so I kind of quickly went to like, oh, and then we'll make a mobile version for you. So that'll be a prototype that you can do in the workshop, and then a mobile version will be settle down. The mobile version will be the one that they can play later after the workshop. Cool? Yeah, great. So that was kind of how, but listening to the client, it was like, this is not the right. What we're supposed to pitch you isn't the right option. So I'm going to pitch you the actual right option. But this is why research is so important, because you may come up against something that says like, oh, they actually should be doing it in this instead of that. So that's why it's like, hold off on trying to define what your technology is. And then, again, this is the phase where you're setting project and design goals. All of this comes into setting project and design goals. And in the context of like your paper for this class, the project and design goals are basically going to be like the conclusions of your paper. Now, this is where we get into what's called the Transformational Framework. I'm going to like further minimize myself. I wonder how many slides it's going to take for me to just like disappear fully here. But this is from one of your other textbooks, the Transformational Framework, by Sabrina Kuliba of Shell Games, whose logo I am covering right now with my little window. But basically, it is something that you want to look at as you are coming up with these ideations, because, and this is going to be an assignment later in the semester when we get into production, but you want to define your high-level purpose, and you can read all this in the textbook. You want to understand who your audience is, and you cannot just say like, oh, it's for everybody, and everybody's going to learn this. The only things that are for everybody are Coke and Pepsi. Everybody else has to define their audiences to like, demographics, gender, age, socioeconomic status, geographic location, all these other factors have something to do with, and being better about defining them. I know it seems like boring and hard, but if you can define those things, it's going to help you make better design decisions. They talk about barriers, so like, why does this group not already have the information? Why do these third graders not already know this kind of math? What is it about this thing that they don't know yet? Why don't they know not to throw trash in the river? Why don't they know, about like some aspect of, what is keeping people from accepting different gender identities or something like that? So you want to look at those barriers. Why does this group of people have these health issues? Instead of just kind of like spouting off a solution, you want to figure out what it is in their life that is not, what is it in their life that's stopping them from already coming to the solution on their own? And then you define like, well, what transformation are we going to make then? It's like I say with the like health problems one. You might notice that a group of people eats only McDonald's, but the issue may not be that they like McDonald's and they don't like, healthier foods. It's maybe they don't have access to the healthier foods. So if you make a game that says don't eat at McDonald's, they'll be like, duh. And you realize, oh, I should have made the, urban gardening game so that we can teach people how to overcome their lack of transportation to where, you know, they can get fresh produce or something like that. And then other aspects of this, I'm not going to go through because there's a lecture for the transformational framework, but things like, you know, consulting expert resources, discovering key concepts from a field, and then, you know, finding, like, supporting research and coming up with an assessment plan. These are all things we're going to cover later. And again, that you can read through the textbook yourself. But in research, these are where you're going to try to figure out these factors. And then you're also going to figure out that expert knowledge. Like, you know, it's not up to you to come up with all the expert knowledge. It's up to, you know, there is expert knowledge probably out there about, you know, pollution, food deserts, all these other things that, you know, or the type of math that you're doing that you might want to consult. So it's not your job as the game designer to be the expert, but it is your job to consult experts. Now, those experts might come from, maybe they are, you can go ask a math teacher. Maybe you can, and we have some wonderful math faculty at Kent State University that you can talk to. Maybe it's that you are, you know, you should find like some research papers, or you should talk to a group that, you know, tries to save a particular, like, body of water. Like, there are probably groups that, you know, are environmental advocates for different, like, rivers and lakes and things like that. Depending on your chosen topic, you know, you have multiple different resources. You're not supposed to be the expert, but you're supposed to learn enough about it to make a game about it by reaching out to the experts. So experts can be, you know, I'm not the instructor that says don't use Wikipedia. Use Wikipedia, but use it right. Use it as a way to find information, but then use the citations in Wikipedia to actually access and cite the information. Take a field trip to where, you know, the place, you know, the neighborhood that your game is supposed to help, the body of water you're trying to protect, you know, whatever that might be. You know, think about, is a field trip something that you can do? And this is in, like, typical game production as well. To learn about ancient Greece, the production team of Assassin's Creed Odyssey went to Greece with a archaeologist / historian. I think she was more of a historian, but about the ancient world. They hired somebody and actually brought her, you know, made her a part of the team, brought her on this trip, and they had this, like, team field trip to Greece. You know, you're probably not going to have such stuff that's so far afield, but, you know, field trips are a big part of, like, how you can engage with this research, seeing things firsthand. Interviews with intended audience. You know, if, again, you're trying to advocate for a group or help people, talk to those people. You know, and a popular topic in this class is, you know, anxiety games, because, you know, a lot of college students deal with stress and anxiety. Don't just lean on the fact of, like, haha, we totally fooled the professor because, like, we're just making a game about us. Haha, we don't have to interview anybody because it's our game. No, still interview your peers. Talk to them about it, because you might get, like, a good, you know, we had a game one time about service workers, and the students, like, who had held themselves service jobs still went and interviewed their friends, because what they did is that in the interstitial, like, loading screens and between levels and things like that, they would include quotes about, you know, what it was like to work these jobs directly from their peers. So that added, like, another extra level of content and an extra level of kind of that emotional context for people that may have never, you know, experienced a kind of, like, abusive service job. So, you know, really leaning on your audience, even if you are in that group, is something you should do, because you'll get extra content and extra meaning and you know, extra kind of, like, emotional weight. And then, you know, there's this thing that the university has called the library. You might have heard of it. it's kind of amazing. It's like this building with books and knowledge in it. You should go there and use that too. And if you go to library.kent.edu, you'll find this website that I've pictured on the bottom, which has like you can search for books and articles on this search bar that my mouse is hovering around. But then over here on the right side, there's these websites like databases A to Z that lets you actually search for databases for particular topic areas. So like you could do, if you're doing kind of like a Save the River or conservation based topic, you can go and look for like environmental studies and conservation based databases and look for papers that might be relevant to your topic of study. This is something that's really important because you're going to have to collect references. This is where you get scholarly references. It's not blogs. It's not, unless, maybe the blog is by like somebody who's actually a scholar, but it's not blogs. It's not even news sites. News sites are kind of like increasingly and horribly not great to cite because of, the increasing like bent to one side or the other. There's significantly more bias than there used to be. So even news sites are kind of tricky to cite. But this is where you can get peer-reviewed, I'm pointing at this because my screen is down here, but this kind of thing is where you will get scholarly, peer-reviewed stuff that, is actually like tested and like bias is weeded out of this kind of writing. So this is the content you want to be citing in your papers. Oops. So games, second order design problem, but we can start to use this research. If we build a good foundation of research, then we can start to build something that is going to inform and get players to the point where we want them to get. We want them to come out of our game with some other new piece of knowledge. And doing a careful research portion and a pre-production portion is going to help us set those experiential goals that that'll help us mold player behavior and have overcome the fact that players can do other random stuff we may not intend. What players do with your rules in games is ultimately up to them, and this is the thing that we have to fight. We want to learn to embrace that, but we want to learn to kind of control this so that players still have the outcome we want. So this is what second order design is. It's the idea that your goal is to shape an experience or play for the user. And again, by doing this baseline of research, it helps us shape this experience in a way that players are going to understand something new through how they interact with our game. But we have to do it through indirect means. We can't just make a cup and be like, okay, well, you're going to experience coffee in this way because you're going to pick up the cup and drink it this particular way. We have to make game rules that direct player activity play, and then they need to come to these conclusions through their play. But again, players do their own random stuff that you don't intend. So how do we kind of bottle that up, like the designers of Team Fortress 2 when they integrated rocket jumping, which was something that players just found on their own. So in the first lecture, we talked about the art game from the Stanley Parable, how it was making a really smart joke that supposed meaningful games that use meaning to get around lazy development practices, or about supposed meaningful games that use meaning to get around lazy development practices. So again, if you recall, in that lecture, I talked about how this game was purposely ineffective. It made a purposely ineffective, meaningful game that just kind of bludgeoned you with its theme. That's not what we want to build. We want to build something where it's integrated and meaningful. Because in this game, the joke was that the developer, the narrator, had to explain its meaning to you while standing next to you. And I've seen a lot of games like this. They're really obnoxious. You know, what we want is to make something that players can find and navigate on their own. So here's just like a YouTube video of a game. Like somebody streamed a game that I made, you know, years ago, that was like a kind of semi-meaningful game that commented on a certain type of art. So some streamer found it and streamed it, and, you know, it did okay. But like, you know, if that game was really like obtuse and, you know, didn't really do a good job of like onboarding you into the game and all this other stuff that like good game design is supposed to do, you know, if it were just kind of this like bare prototype for a mechanic with like an obnoxious theme, the streamer would not have been able to like access or play it, or would have probably not chosen to make a video out of it. You want people who you will never meet to be able to access and understand and decipher your game, because then that's how your game becomes successful and people can download and buy it and enjoy it. You know, this is a type of game design that, like, if we can incorporate the ways that we make games fun for players, then people will actually want to play our transformational games. And if people want to play them, then they will work because, you know, people will then like interact with our meaningful systems. So games are not like teapots. They are a second order design problem where we are not directly defining the player's use of the game. This is true for both commercial and transformational games. Even more important in transformational games, where we not only have to create satisfying play, but have it carry a message that must be discernible by any player. So this is why we use a concept called procedural rhetoric. This term was coined by Ian Bogost in your textbook, Persuasive Games. And it consists of two parts. So procedure, defining ability to execute a series of rules, which is a definition by Janet Murray, scholar Janet Murray. And rhetoric, the ability to use different means, oratory, so speech, written rhetoric, visual rhetoric, etc., to communicate or express ideas effectively. So those are the two halves of it. Basically rules and you know, expression or you know, argument. So if we combine them, we get procedural rhetoric, the practice of using processes persuasively. So using rules and feedback, because games have input and output. They have interactivity, like we talked about. You know, they have input-output. Using rules and feedback for persuasive or expressive purposes. So I want you to consider this. In the game Legend of Zelda: Ocarina of Time, there is a sequence where Zelda, a young Zelda, asks you, Link, will you save Hyrule? Now, you can say yes or no. Now, if you say no, like our kind of cheeky Link does here, Zelda says something to the effect of, but Ganon will destroy the world if you don't. Will you save Hyrule? So it kind of cycles back around to the same yes or no choice. Now, again, you have a yes or no choice. So you could say no again. But the thing about The Legend of Zelda is that, you know, in other games, so like, say, Skyrim or Elden Ring, things that are kind of like open world and have sort of open moralities, sometimes you'll be able to say no, and then that's it. You'll say no, but then a little flag in the background in the game logic will tag, and then maybe that'll send you on like a different narrative path. That's not how Zelda works. In Zelda's going to basically like keep badgering you with the same like, hey, let's, but you're going to save Hyrule, right? Until you acquiesce and say like, okay, fine, I'll save Hyrule. Because Zelda's not a game that is interested in a sort of like open-ended system of narrative choices. It's interested in you being the hero. And because it is interested and it is about you being a hero good versus evil. You're playing a game in which the game needs to communicate what is the right behavior and the wrong behavior. And the wrong behavior is not acting like a hero. Now, to some people, that's incredibly limiting and annoying. I like Zelda a lot. But, when I play Zelda, I'm kind of like putting myself in the mental framework of like, okay, I'm playing Zelda, so I'm not going to expect to be able to go and actually become like the villain myself, because that's not what I signed up for when I played Zelda. I'll play another game if I want to. I'll play, Fable if I want to go become the villain. And I cite that basically because like there's a new Fable game coming. Not to cite like older games. There's a new Fable game coming, at least at the time of this recording. Someday this will be an old reference too. But this is how procedures enforce ideas. And again, that can seem very ham-fisted, but that's kind of... This is a tool in our toolbox. You can make the open-ended game. You can make the kind of railroaded game. Both are right in certain situations. There is not one inherently better way over the other. Because, again, games have different purposes. So it's important to think about things like the core mechanic. When we think about procedural rhetoric, we want to think of the core mechanic and an extension of the core mechanic, which is the core game loop, which is like, what is the thing that the cycle of input and output that happens that informs like the main action of the game. So let's consider Super Mario, like in the original Super Mario Brothers. So if we look at his core mechanic, which is jumping, we need to think about how jumping is repeated and reinforced throughout the game. So Mario, for example, when you jump, and I don't know if it made a little boing sound. Okay. Well, it made a little boing sound on my end. I don't know if you heard it on the YouTube stream, but when you jump, you get a pleasant boing sound, and that's kind of cool. Hey, ooh, that feels good. Jump, boing, hey, that's fun. But then, they put stuff in the level that's fun to jump over, stuff to jump at, jump on. So the level is enforcing this idea of jumping. And then we add something like enemies that are fun to jump on, and when you jump on an enemy, you get points. And that's like feedback for doing the activity. And that's really satisfying. So these are all elements that, go into the idea of like reinforcing jumping. Jumping is the core, but we create gameplay by having things to jump on, jump over, jump at, and that kind of reinforces the interactivity, the appropriate interactivity. And then eventually you get, the flagpole, which is a jumping test of sorts. So these are all like other mechanics that go into reinforce the main mechanic of jumping. And that's sort of like, jump, get points, jump, get item, jump, those are all like the core game loop. And then the jumping obstacle courses become levels that, again, if you were to make like what's called a vertical slice of, and we'll talk about what that is in a few lectures, of Super Mario Brothers, you might have like, the first few levels, maybe even like the first 4 levels. And that would get you the idea of like, this is the core loop of Mario. You have 4 levels, getting to Bowser's castle, sorry Mario, Princess is another castle, but it's like these obstacle courses. Then that gives you a sense of like what Mario is. So that's core mechanics and core game loop and how they're reinforced through game design. Now, core mechanics are communicated and work. Now, assuming like we're not using an instruction booklet, which like there haven't really been comprehensive instruction booklets in games for like many, many years at this point. I would love them to come back because they were fun. But, the game should speak for itself. And the way we do that is we use psychology to allow games to speak through their input-output mechanics and feedback. So there's 3 types of psychology I'm going to focus on in terms of like this kind of interactivity in games. And this is the kind of psychology that when it comes to transformational games, we can use this psychology to reinforce not only the gameplay ideas of like it's good to jump, but also the gameplay ideas of, you know, this is how you do this type of math problem and you did the math problem right. Or, you know, if your game character chucks something in the river in the game punishes you, whereas if you like put your trash away the right way, it rewards you or something like that. So there's behavior theory, Montessori method, and constructivism. So behavior theory, you know, there are a few scholars in this area, but we care about this guy, B.F. Skinner, who developed the concept, which is called operant conditioning. But basically it has several parts. It has positive reinforcement, which is a reward for favorable behavior. So that one there. You know, and that's your like get coin, jump at block, get coin. You know, jump on Goomba, get 100 points. In the classic Skinner box, you know, so trigger warning, animal abuse. But in the classic Skinner box experiment, this is where if the light was on and the rat pulled the lever, they would get food. Negative reinforcement is rewarding favorable behavior by eliminating negative conditions. So again, trigger warning, animal abuse. Skinner would like slightly electrify the floor, and if the rat pulled the lever, the bad condition of the electrified floor would go away. So this happens in games too. You might have like, I remember in Batman Arkham Asylum from, you know, 13 years ago or so, there would be a level where it was filled with poison gas, and if you like pulled the switches, you know, you had to try to stay above the gas, but if you pulled the 3 switches, the gas would go away, and then you'd open up a new part of the level because it would not be filled with poison gas anymore. So that's kind of like the negative reinforcement aspects of game design. And then punishment is, you know, you did a bad thing. So you didn't make the jump, you didn't jump effectively, you fall in a pit. Or you just ran at an enemy and you get hit and you die or you lose power. You know, that's how punishments work. So negative reinforcement and punishments are different things. Punishments are where you actually punish a player for doing the wrong action. So games use positive reinforcements all the time. I've talked about coins and points. You might get, you know, do a thing, explore. You know, so this is a good teaching tool within games itself. But this is also where you get into that rhetoric of like, oh, games just use conditioning and they condition people to do bad or good things. There's a lot of research that actually, no, games do not condition violence. I'm not going to go into like the full things on that because it's outside of the scope of this like lecture, but it's wrong. But you know, this is a very normal thing in games. You see it all over the place in the form of like suits and hats and power-ups and all kinds of stuff. So it's not something that we necessarily that should be foreign to you as a game designer. You should be very familiar with this. But conditioning is only a small part of the psychological tools used by games, and this is again one of the factors that weigh into like games do not just condition you to do bad things or whatever. So games actually have a lot of what's called positive psychology. So another aspect is called Montessori Method, which is a teaching framework invented by Italian educator Maria Montessori. And basically it revolves around the idea of students using their senses and interacting with objects to absorb information. And that information is then turned by the person's brain into the solutions to problems. So it's the basis of a lot of what we consider like the way you learn in kindergarten and the way kindergarten works. But methods similar to it appear in design schools, especially in introductory classes where students do like small projects to learn basic principles kinesthetically through interactivity and not just, you know, kind of being lectured about them. This is actually one of the reasons that I have you do so much stuff in my classes apart from these lectures, is that, you know, that's where you really like internalize these concepts. So here's an image from the famous German design school, the Bauhaus, taken in 1928. Here, Professor Joseph Albers is evaluating student projects where they had to make forms out of paper and cardboard. This was how students learned about just like structure and design and form and shape by making these like objects. So it's this like kind of abstract design process. But that helps give them a baseline for when they actually design things like furniture and chairs and chess sets and buildings and all kinds of stuff. So how does this work in games? An example that Bogost uses is that, let's say you're playing Ninja Gaiden for the NES, and so you get a chance to experiment with Ryu's like movement mechanics. He can wall jump, he can climb, but then you can wall jump in such a way that like you can experiment with it. But if you fall, no big deal, you land. But you get to experiment with and master his moves through these kinds of like safe environments. But then later, these things are extrapolated upon. Suddenly you're having to make wall jumps over pits, and you're having to make many chained wall jumps. The idea is that you understand like one version of it, and then you can play with the extrapolated, more complex version of it. Now imagine if these indicators were aligned with game mechanics that also involved educational or transformational ideas. You can start to see how a game might incorporate the basics of a procedure in math or English or some school topic, and then scaffold, which is a term in teaching for like making more and more complex versions of a concept. But you can see where like level 1 is the basic version of a concept, and then mechanics are added as the game progresses. But mechanics also mirror elements of that thing you're trying to teach. So you can actually explore a topic quite thoroughly through scaffolding in Montessori if you are kind of like giving it to the player in a structured way, step by step. So Montessori Method is like really powerful for this type of teaching. It's something that's really excellent, and it helps people internalize things through that interactivity, through that sort of step-by-step scaffolding process. The other thing that games do really well is Constructivism, a method championed by educators David Kolb and Ron Fry. This method combines the two previous methods in a way. It focuses on students absorbing information and problem solving like Montessori, but also uses failure as part of an ongoing iterative process. The trick with Constructivism is that it allows for trial and error. And this is actually why we have so much feedback in our classes. I am a constructivist as a teacher. I am a person who believes in that feedback and then like going back and trying again and things like that. That's how I structure my classes. So this is how games work though, where if you set a condition for failure that's not that severe, players can say, okay, well that wasn't the way to solve. I keep using math as an example, but like I'll keep on it. Well, that wasn't the solution to the problem. Let me try this other solution to the problem. And then, they can eventually figure out which procedure is the right one. Or which is the most optimal way to build a wind farm for energy, I built the wind farm in the middle of a neighborhood. That was bad. Why was that bad? Well, maybe I should build it in this other place instead. So allowing people to try things and get feedback on their trial and error processes, that's a really powerful teaching tool. And again, this is the same kind of thing you see in all video games, because you have things like lives or continues, or maybe games just let you try infinitely. That can be really, really good. It's good for teaching people how to master games. It's good at teaching people how to master your game, but also learn something from your game if your game's a transformational game. And again, games are well suited to this because how they integrate things like lives and chances and other mechanisms that allow you to try again. In older games, these were more limited because, you're trying to get quarters out of people, like, oh, put in a quarter for another continue. But in this kind of game design, we can have conditions for failure, but then maybe we just, don't we don't create it in such a severe way that the game stops. Maybe it's like, oh, you failed, but you can try again as many times as you want to. And as the game Celeste says, your death count is really just how use it. Look at it with pride because it's how much you've learned about the game. That's kind of how we think about failure in transformational games. Is that's your opportunities for learning, like what not to do and what types of things you can do to like improve your understanding of a topic. So that's where I'm going to stop for today. The case study is a game by Windfall, but I mentioned Wind Farms earlier. This is a game that lets you use these methods, these psychological methods, to build wind farms, and it gives you feedback based on like your choices. So go give it a shot. It's a pretty fun game, but look at it in terms of these methodologies. And then your assignment for next week is to prepare your paper outline. And all this stuff is on Canvas. But also, I'm going to make sure I tell everybody this. Please, please, please have references in the outline. Have a list of works cited. It doesn't have to be your entire works cited, but just start including works cited that you're working with and reference things in line in your outline so that I see where your talking points are coming from. That's it. We'll go into some more of these topics later. So I hope you enjoyed the lecture, and I will talk to you later. Bye.